Set?
All right, I think we're good.
Okay. I just want to thank the Gleasons for inviting me, putting this together. I have been here before. We spoke in the other rooms. The last time we spoke, it was certainly pre-COVID, so yes.
Could I ask you to stand?
Yeah, happily. No, I have no problem with that.
Well, so much for the chair. I mean, I can do that.
So, as Bill said, I'm the solid waste manager for the city of Lebanon. I have the honor of managing all of your garbage. My career is full of garbage. I have been with the city for about 15 years. I've managed a variety of programs in my career. I worked for the city of Nashua for a little while. It's the second largest city in the state of New Hampshire. I worked for the state of New Hampshire, helping write legislation, writing rules, a variety of things. While at the state, I was the state's recycling coordinator, managed compost facilities all over the place. I had my own company for a little while. So I've done a lot of things as it relates to trash. So I guess in that makes me some sort of an expert in trash. If you can have such a distinction, or if you want such a distinction, maybe. I was asked earlier, how did I get into this? And I really just kind of fell into it. I went to college at Keene State in Keene, New Hampshire, where I was studying environmental science. And as my work study, I helped manage the college's recycling program. And then the recycling industry is a fairly small family. So at that time particularly, it's grown considerably now, but at the time that pool was pretty shallow. So I got involved with the industry and it just kind of evolved, and over the years just continued to grow and do different things. So it's exciting, it's a lot of fun. Yeah?
In mind of what you're saying, I would suggest that people haven't done it, just go on YouTube and pick out any one of the number of recycling films that they do. It's really fascinating to watch a major industrial recycling operation.
It is, and that's one of the biggest changes in the last decade that I think we've all seen. Particularly in the Upper Valley, we've seen this evolution of what was called curb sort that many of you may remember, where you put your recyclables out at the curb in a variety of categories. That is now one category. There are some efficiencies for that, and that was why the industry moved in that direction. Not requiring specialized trucks and things of that nature. But as a result, it creates contamination and things of that nature. So my talk today is not primarily going to be focused on recycling, although I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I will focus on waste reduction. But I think it's important for people, and I try to say this as often as I can, the way you recycled at the curb with curb sort is exactly the same today, except it all goes in one bin. So when people are confused about, can I recycle this, can I not recycle this, it's actually not changed. So if it's a bottle or a jar, it's still recyclable. The confusion happens because there are so many types of plastics in the world right now, and simply because as a society we've added plastic everywhere does not mean that it's recyclable. So the same plastics that were recyclable 10 years ago are the same plastics that are recyclable today. So some of those odd trays and plates and utensils and wraps and things of that nature weren't recyclable back then, and in many cases are still not recyclable today. So that's really the bottom line, is the the specification for recycling and sorting, it hasn't changed. The confusion is just the products available to us today are so different. Yep. Right. So the symbol that's on plastics, and well, primarily plastics, 1 through 7, there's a little triangle. That's only an indication of the chemicals used to produce that particular item. So it's not an indication of recyclability. And it never was. It just, at one time, we're like, okay, numbers 1 and 2 are recyclable, so we were trained in that, right? So we've carried through with that, but the intent of that symbol only indicates what it's made of, actually. It's not about recyclability. And you can ask a lot of people, can I recycle number 6? Absolutely. You could recycle anything. The problem is the availability of a stable market and market quantities. So things like styrofoam, I know recently the Upper Valley has been doing these special collection events, but styrofoam is an example of something that technically is recyclable, but getting the quantities to a recycler is challenging and expensive. So typically it's not a recycled product. Does that make sense? Yeah.
That's one of my questions.
Okay.
Is it possible to have local places for styrofoam instead of waiting twice a year for the one down in Lebanon?
So there is, if a community is willing to invest in that. So styrofoam is actually a very small portion of the waste that we generate, but it consumes a lot of space. So if a facility is to accept, like we were asked in Lebanon, and I said no, we don't have the space to store styrofoam.
Yeah, I've got a bag in my upstairs.
And and so for me, the other reason why we're not ready to accept that as a recyclable product is because styrofoam doesn't rot, and if it's got to sit in your basement for 6 months, it'll be okay. So that was kind of the rationale behind that, whereas other products have other challenges, but styrofoam, it's literally not going anywhere, and waiting is an acceptable, in my mind, is an acceptable response. There's far other...
But there is a place in New Jersey that does recycle.
So there's a place in... I'm not sure where it is. I know they were shipping it to Western Massachusetts, and I think it was being processed there, and then it was going someplace else. So it's challenging as far as where things end up, and all that goes into that. The economics of recycling is challenging, and right now, if you drive anywhere and you look at diesel fuel prices, they're twice what they were 4 months ago. I think on 12A it's about $6.50 a gallon for diesel fuel. So the cost of moving items here and there is very expensive. And we have a fairly centralized system, so aggregating products is very challenging and only is getting more challenging. The flip of it is, as fuel prices go up, the value of recyclable products actually goes up as well. So because the cost of virgin material is also expensive, things like recyclable plastics and things of that nature also tend to follow that cost model. So as we see the price, like when I see the prices of fuel going up, I'm like, yes, we can move more recyclables now, but it costs more money to get them to market. So there are some funny balances to work there, but yes.
When you mentioned styrofoam isn't going anywhere, I'm not criticizing, you're right, it's not going to disintegrate, but it does go into the ocean, and a lot of fish see it as
Yep.
things to eat, and they can't digest it. So if we can figure out a way to have it, not to continue to
Right.
use it, and then eventually some way to recycle it, that would be right.
Absolutely. So, and I couldn't agree more, and that's a great segue into something that I've been working on for the last 5 years, is just having worked in the waste industry for more than 2 decades, and just seeing the problems are not going away. They're only getting more complex. is we need to stop making so much waste. That's really what we need to focus on. And that recycling, although a good thing, is secondary. It's not we need to focus on recycling. And one of the things that really pushed me in this direction was bottled water. Bottled water is consumed at an unbelievable rate. And there's a level of acceptance with drinking bottled water because the bottle it comes in is recyclable. So we feel this level of comfort because, I can recycle this bottle, but even recycling produces waste. And the other piece of recycling that people miss is the reality of recycling is we have this vision of recycling that all recycling goes back into the product that we just recycled. So I have my plastic water bottle, I put it in the bin, it goes through this magical process, and it comes back as a water bottle. But that is not the reality. The reality is that plastic goes off and makes carpet, or clothing, or insulation, or reusable shopping bags, or some other product. So I teach a course at Dartmouth, and one of the concepts that I present is this notion of a linear waste model, that even through recycling, it's a linear model. So we produce the recyclable, we recycle it, it's producing something else, which ultimately is going to be landfilled. I mean, the carpet, although is recyclable, very often is not, even if it's made of recycled products, which is fantastic. You're not using raw materials. Again, these are not bad things. It's just a reality that people don't realize, that a lot of our recycling doesn't go back into the product that it manufactures. Things like aluminum and steel, those are typically circular recycling models. Glass is not typically a recycling, a circular model. It's a linear model in the Northeast, because we don't have access to bottle-to-bottle recycling in the Northeast. It's either going as a construction product, or for a lot of glass in the Northeast, it's going as a material to be used as fiberglass insulation. So it's a linear model. And please understand, I'm not suggesting that it's a bad thing. I think it's important for people to realize that it's not true circular recycling. It's good that we're using recycled materials and not virgin products that we're pulling out of the earth. We're using waste products, but it still requires virgin products to produce some of those containers. So, yes.
Is legislation part of your model?
As far as my involvement?
Well, or you mentioned you teach the course at Dartmouth, and there are progressions to improve this part of society. So I'm just curious about whether legislation is part of that equation.
Oh, so it is. There's no silver bullet, and one of the things that I've said over the years is you can't legislate good behavior, and we see it over and over again with things like speeding, murder, theft. Those are things that are against the law, but continue. So I know Vermont has passed a lot of legislation to move in a different direction. And it's interesting to look at New Hampshire and Vermont. New Hampshire is the live free or die state, and there's very little legislation to push somebody in a direction. Vermont has taken a different model and has a lot of legislation. The two states don't have much difference in what is actually being accomplished. They're using very different models. What would be interesting is to see if a blend would accomplish even more. So New Hampshire focuses heavily on market development and market initiation and how economics play into things and things like that, whereas Vermont uses a legislative model to push and require people to make these decisions. But there's insufficient infrastructure to support some of that legislation. So it's interesting to see how it plays out. Massachusetts has another different model. They do a lot of state-supported programs to encourage more development of recycling, so you see a lot more recycling market development happening in Massachusetts than you see in New Hampshire and Vermont. So each state is very different. And earlier I was asked, is there such a document that exists to kind of illustrate or explain what goes where and how? Just these 3 states here, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont, we all do things very differently. And each one, although may have access to similar recycling markets, how we get them there is very different. I mean, the Lebanon solid waste program manages the waste for 22 towns. And probably there are 6 or 7 different ways of recycling in our 22 towns. Even if 2 communities are using zero sort or single stream, you might be using 2 different processing facilities to sort that material, in which case you're going to have 2 different specifications, what can be accepted and what can't, for a variety of reasons. One that a lot of people don't realize is, I'll just use black plastic. Black plastic is typically not a recycled product, primarily because most recycling facilities use optical sort machines to pull out different items. And the optical sort machines don't see black because the conveyor belt is black. So it won't recognize, right, exactly, that right there.
This is number 1.
Right, but that is not recyclable anywhere I'm aware of.
Okay.
For a variety of reasons, here,
So our video audience can benefit from this.
so this is a number 1 plastic, according to Donna. I'm not seeing the,
Yeah, I had.
oh, there it is, right there.
I had to find the last
Yep. So it is a number 1 plastic, but for 2 reasons it's not recyclable, and one is it's the color. With facilities that sort optically, it's not going to recognize this, but there are some facilities that sort manually. There's a facility in Vermont where there's people who physically pull material off the sort line. So we can see the color, but this AI or robotics, which is the direction that the industry is moving in, because how many people have seen a help wanted sign? We've all seen that. And so the industry is experiencing the same thing and struggling with people to sort this material, so they're relying on robotics to perform this task now. So this is typically not recyclable in our region because it's of the color, but also because although it says number 1, this is a different type of number 1 than most bottles. So what we've moved to at our facility is shape, not number. I've said ignore the number, look at the shape. If it's a bottle, jar, jug, tub, those are typically recyclable plastics, easily recyclable anywhere. Now, when you get into these things, or the plates that prepared chicken comes in, or things of that nature, no, garden containers are in certain places. So we're working on a program in our area where the nurseries will take it back. So if you get flower pots, you should ask the nursery, can I bring this back? Because there is a domestic recycling option for flower pots. It's located in Michigan, and they manufacture flower pots right here in the US out of old flower pots. So that's what I mean. Each item has its own little nuances. You can't put those flower pots in your curbside bin or at your recycling center. It's a different avenue. You have to take it back to the nursery. Right, right. And again, that's part of the confusion. So, but this is an interesting example. We see this all the time. The amount of plastic that we've recycled in Lebanon has doubled in the last 2 years. But I will say it's also the most contaminated recyclable that we manage. We spend a lot of time on plastic, just pulling it out.
And doing what?
Doing what with what we pull out? Throwing it away. Yep. So if you put this in your recycling bin, so this is one thing that I tell people is, when in doubt, throw it out. And I know a lot of folks don't like that, but the environmental impact of recycling wrong is greater than you realize. So let's say we put this in our recycling bin, okay? If you threw this in the trash, where would it go? It would go to Lebanon, right? Which is what, 15 minutes from here. If this were to go in your recycling bin, this would go to White River Junction, be long hauled to either Rutland or Charlestown, Massachusetts, to be sorted, and from there it would be removed as a contaminant and then sent to either an incinerator in Massachusetts or a landfill in eastern New Hampshire or a landfill in northern Vermont. So the transportation impacts of doing it wrong are greater than the hope that this might be recyclable. Does that make sense? So, yeah.
Is there any reason then that we continue to make things like that kind of container in glass?
Because it's cheap. Frankly, it's inexpensive. So one thing to remember about plastic, now I am not pro-plastic. I mean, I work hard to remove plastic from our waste stream at my home, but plastic has a benefit. The cost of moving plastic is really cheap. An example that I give is, we look at plastic versus glass. I worked with a company a number of years ago who was trying to change their product container from glass to a plastic container. The environmental benefits were enormous moving to plastic. The glass was coming from Germany, shipped over here to the US, filled with the product, and then would be trucked all over the place. So glass is heavy, it consumes more diesel fuel to move, is typically not recyclable anyway, but in our minds, glass is better than plastic. The plastic that we were looking at was made domestically in the United States, consumed far less space in a landfill than the glass did, because the glass would very likely be ending up in a landfill more often than not, and it consumes less transportation. It's got a smaller transportation footprint. So I'm not promoting plastic. I just think it's important for people to understand how are some of these decisions made, that it's a much bigger thing than moving away from, this isn't recyclable. There are other reasons for that move. The other thing to remember too is our economy is moving away from, it seems like fairly rapidly in the last couple of years, away from a petroleum-based economy where there's a lot of electric cars. There's talk about transferring, we had a conversation about police cars a couple of weeks ago, and that Ford is looking at converting all of their police cars to electric in the next 3 or 4 years. So there's this move away from petroleum-based fuels. Well, these petroleum companies aren't just going to go, okay, thanks for the good times, we're moving on. They're making other products. So a lot of these electric cars are being made out of plastic, right? Because those petroleum companies have to produce something, so they're manufacturing other things now. It's a lot of our clothing is and will be even more plastic-based. Plastic production is slated to increase, not decrease, in ways that, like all the face masks that we wear are plastic-based. So there's a lot of plastic in other areas of our lives. We're just not aware of how it kind of creeps in. But that move away from a petroleum-based fuel economy into an electric economy does not mean that the petroleum products are going away. They're just shifting gears into a different, into a production model. So, sorry, that's the reality of that particular thing. So that's why we see so much plastic too, is they're looking to manufacture as much as they can. So.
You said something about glass. It's not recyclable?
Glass is, there's not many recycling options, true recycling options in the Northeast. So very often what's happening is glass that makes its way into a single stream or a zero sort process gets crushed and is combined with a variety of other things and is then sent to landfills to be used as a construction material. So it's a very linear model. There's not a lot of bottle-to-bottle glass recyclers available. So it's not recycled in the same way that we think it is. That vision just is not there.
Where are those little Coke bottles?
Right, the returnables, right.
Returnables.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They're not there anymore. I mean, there are pockets like McNamara Dairy. There's a small dairy in Canterbury, New Hampshire that does returnable yogurt jars at the co-op. There are little pockets that I encourage everybody to support, because in that model, it's very localized. You know, McNamara is making dairy products here, you're purchasing it here, and you're returning it back here. So it's not being shipped all over the place. But even that particular dairy has moved towards plastic because people aren't bringing the bottles back. We're interested in buying the glass because we have this vision of it being more environmental, but they're not being returned. So they've had to shift gears themselves. They prefer the refillable, but you know, the customer's not bringing the bottle back. So that's challenging. So does that all make sense?
Should be asked if people will take their stuff back. They will take their bottles back and refill them, or they'll take their sugar containers back, or whatever they sell.
Yeah, what role could activism play?
Plays a huge role, you know, and I think because, I mean, we live in a capitalist society, and everything's driven by economics and what the consumer wants. So there's some questions too where you can't help but wonder who's driving that discussion. Is it this or is it us? And very often what's happening is the product packaging is changing. I really like Doritos. I continue to buy Doritos regardless of the packaging. So we're voting with our wallet repeatedly. You know, and so you can change that model by asking questions, you know, like you said, is this recyclable? No, it's really not. If you call the company, they're going to tell you yes, because technically it is recyclable someplace, not here. There's a lot of, it's called greenwashing, where companies will promote a particular product or package. One of the things now that I just think is absolutely appalling is this new boxed water. I don't know if you guys have seen that. It comes in a carton now, kind of like, you know, half and half comes in a carton, and it's promoted as, you know, a less environmental impact. And maybe it is on some level, but they completely avoid the issue that that product is not recyclable. It's completely waste because it's a composite. It's not paper. There is plastic in that carton because paper doesn't hold liquid very well. You need something else to hold it, and plastic holds it. So there is plastic in that. So that particular product is completely waste. But it's being promoted as, you know, we're using less plastic, which is true, but you can't recycle that product. I mean, it's a one-way thing. It goes right into a landfill. There's no very successful carton recycling programs. There's a few, but not many. And as far as available to this region, it's certainly not. So.
Well, you mentioned polyester fabric. How much of an issue is clothing at the Netherlands facility? You know, clothing that people throw out.
Like how much in the waste is clothing?
A significant amount.
So the question was about clothing. Is clothing a significant amount disposed? I mean, it's, you know, it's probably in the single-digit numbers as far as what's thrown out. The biggest thing right now that's discarded with any amount of quantity is food waste. That's the biggest thing. So I try to encourage people to, you know, shop better, you know, prepare foods differently, and compost what's left. It's not just about compost your food scraps. Compost your food scraps. You need to look at what you're composting, and if you're throwing away food that was never even consumed, then you should change the way you shop. to reduce the amount of waste that you're producing. And composting or whatever is a secondary. It's not your primary mode of waste management. So clothing is challenging too. I mean, there's issues with clothing. I mean, we can all attest to our clothing is literally cheaper now. It's thinner. It's hard to find cotton or natural fiber clothing without spending an enormous amount of money. Clothing that ends up in secondary markets and goes overseas isn't as attractive any longer because it's such low quality clothing. Americans consume an enormous amount of clothing, very different than what we used to. It's referred to as fast fashion. Trends change so rapidly, and it's just, they're cheap. You know, I remember one day I was like, I shop at Listen for some of my work clothes, and I went to Listen and I looked at pricing, and I went to Walmart and I looked at pricing, and Walmart was cheaper than Listen. You know, and it just seemed crazy, but the quality of the clothing at Listen was actually better than it was at Walmart. But, you know, if you want a t-shirt for work, you know, you're left with this economic decision. So it can be very challenging, absolutely challenging. So, but
What you're saying is that an individual has to be responsible.
absolutely, that's one of the, so it's like it's not a silver bullet in my mind, it's a quiver of arrows. And one of those arrows is individual responsibility. And you're 100% right that very often we as people, and I include myself in this we point at everybody else around us. China did this and now we can't recycle. Well, that's not really what happened. You know, the large waste companies are doing this and they're the ones at fault. They're receiving what we don't want, and we're expecting them to do miracles and unicorns and rainbows out of, you know, what we throw in our recycling bins. And we put a lot of responsibility on them. We look to the manufacturers and go, why aren't you how come legislation's not, we all have some skin in the game and need to step up and get involved and absolutely participate in it. So oh, no, thank you. Thank you. Yep.
I've heard that the fashion industry is extraordinarily costly in environmental terms for a whole variety of reasons. The kinds of things they grow, the transportation costs, the dyeing and washing and all that. But also that horrifying statistic, I think it relates to the United States. The average piece of clothing is worn 7 or 8 times and then thrown out.
Yes, that's the.
Really horrifying. And there are, somebody sent me a video of a high desert in Chile, maybe, or Argentina, where they're just like mountainous mounds of all this clothing that doesn't break down.
Yep.
And it's just sitting there in the desert where not many people live. It's horrible.
Yep. So and that's why it's referred to as fast fashion, that it is only worn a few times before it's discarded. It's not designed to last any longer. It's, you know, hey, if I can get you to buy 1 shirt, what if I could get you to buy 3, you know, in the span of whatever. So it's absolutely, it's on that level too. Yep.
I think this maybe is a year or 2 ago, but the people who made Levi's came back and asked for all their old Levi's that people had to turn them in.
Yep.
So they could use, because the denim was all cotton. So they were able to, I suppose, if you think about it, soften it down and somehow use that product.
Yep.
That's probably expensive. I mean, that's not an expensive pair of jeans, maybe, but, or jacket, or shirt, but that company has seen the best with it. So if you were really dealing with a piece of clothing that was 100%, you know, cotton or wool or whatever, there is a chance that people would do it, that things could be recycled.
Absolutely. And that comes back to personal responsibility. You know, we look at, well, a $50 or $60 pair of jeans or a $20 pair of jeans. Well, you get what you pay for, you know, and very often you end up wearing it out faster, and it's just, like I said, the quality is not there like it used to be. It's very different. But
And the art of mending is lost.
the art of mending is lost, absolutely. Yep. I know in Vermont, there's we were going to try them, but then COVID came. There's a few places in Vermont that do things called repair cafes, and they do things like mending, fixing a toaster, extending the life of a product as opposed to just discarding it. It builds community. Those are events that I think there's a few in Montpelier. It's great to build community. You bring volunteers in, you set up a tent with some tools, and people will come in with a broken bicycle or, like I said, a toaster or a lamp, and they help each other repair it instead of producing a waste. So it's interesting to see that type of thing happening, like it's a new idea. It's interesting how these things get packaged. It's not, a lot of people did that. You would darn socks, or, there was a variety of things that were done that, because there's this perceived abundance of everything, that why not just buy new? Why would I repair this? I'll just go, I don't have time. I'm taking the kids to soccer, or, one thing or another. But it is personal choice. But I think it's interesting how it seems to be coming back. There's a different youth that's coming back.
This is a generation, I'm sure, who grew up seeing shoe repair stores
Yep.
on the block, or cheap TV.
Right.
You can't repair it.
No. No, it's cheaper to just go get a new one. Probably for less than $100, you can replace it.
Country, I guess, for lack of a better word, is doing it right, and you're approaching.
There are some European models that seem to be working, but even those, it's important to understand that it's not an apples to apples comparison. A lot of European countries have very different tax systems than we do in this country. So some of those programs are supported by government subsidies and other legislative requirements. So it's very different. So when we're looking at I see it more locally. Like, I hear people in New Hampshire going, look what they're doing over in Vermont. They've got a disposal ban on this, and they've got this requirement, and they've got that. Why aren't we doing that in New Hampshire? And it's just, so it's interesting when we compare each other to each other. It can be a dangerous thing because we don't always see what helped build that model. We end up, recognizing that there are differences in different places culturally that things are acceptable. You look at, you mentioned Chile, or you look at places in Africa where things are looked at very differently, or in places in Asia where everything, a bicycle, we get loads of bicycles every day in Lebanon. They're just thrown away. In other countries, those bikes would be stripped for parts and used as transportation. Here, I grew out of it. And it's not even, can I find somebody else who wants this? It's just, the thought is, discard it. We don't even think about some of the other options. Whereas in other countries, because of a lack of resources, those waste products are resources. And for us, because there's so much wealth, there's this view of, I'll just buy a new one. What? So it's a different, when we look at other places, it's different to do that. There's some amazing places in India that are doing some incredible things. There are pockets all over the place where communities are doing some very incredible things. I think we're getting better, but we're not really great at community. We're very independent. If this person's doing that, I might opt to do something different. There's not a lot of, let's work together to move this down the field kind of thing. It's just a very different culture that we have here. So it's not right or wrong. It's just different.
Is that to say that the North Koreans don't have trash?
They probably do, but that's an interesting observation that due to lack of resources, an example is literally China. So China was the world's recycler because they consumed their natural resources at such a rate that they needed to find another avenue for raw materials. So a great raw material is recyclables. So China just started consuming enormous amounts of recyclables. And now they have their own environmental problems, and that was one reason why they stopped taking all of the recyclables for the world, essentially, because they had their own problems to deal with. And they're industrializing and have their own waste to manage and, you know, things of that nature. So.
And coal.
And coal, yes, and coal. So, as we talk about all of these things, it always leads me back to, recycling doesn't solve the problem. What solves the problem is stop making so much waste. And those are conscious individual decisions that we can make, but also you see corporations like Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks looking into offering reusable containers because they're seeing this move, there's this shift in society for reuse. So it does exist and is happening on corporate levels. There are a variety of interesting new businesses that have cropped up in the last 5 years where they're share-based models where a large corporation starts to inventory their own materials and tools so they have a better sense of what's in stock to reduce some of the inventory that they have. I mean, now it's difficult to go to, like if we have to order a part to fix a piece of machinery, places don't keep stuff in stock like they used to. It's a much more real-time experience now that if you need something, sometimes it's literally made to order, but the inventory is very limited, which creates what we're seeing now with these supply chain issues, where when the transportation model gets disrupted, your on-time inventory can't happen because there's no way to get those parts around. So, but it's interesting to see how corporations are moving. You see companies like Hypotherm in Lebanon, New Hampshire, do these corporate decisions where they have zero landfill policies, where they talked with their upstream vendors and said, we want to change the model. We don't want you to ship us parts in cardboard boxes or these blister pack plastic containers. We want everything to come in returnable packaging. And they did it. They've changed. It's taken them years, but as a corporation, they made a decision and developed a plan and moved in a direction. So it is happening, but it's in these areas that you wouldn't suspect. Why would I think Hypotherm as a waste reduction model? Stonyfield Yogurt did it a number of years ago, and it created an outrage when they changed their, I think it's a quart yogurt tub. It used to be a number 2. I don't know if you guys remember that, but the tub used to be a number 2. Probably, goodness, it was probably 25, 30 years ago now. They changed that number 2 to a number 5, and people were outraged. How could you do this? Well, the reason they did was because number 5 plastic is a sturdier plastic, so they used far less plastic in their packaging, even though they still continue to have the same size. So the plastic was literally thinner, so they were consuming less plastic. And they recognized that the majority of those tubs were not recycled, so by switching the type of plastic actually reduced waste instead of keeping it at number 2 and hoping people would recycle. So it's strange where we see it. It's not always easy to recognize some of these changes that are out there, but it is out there.
But so the co-op in Lebanon takes number 5s and sent them to a company called Preserve, and they are made into, they're made into little, plastic containers, for your refrigerator. But they also make toothbrushes, and you can recycle the toothbrush.
Back into toothbrushes. Yep.
So, Lebanon Co-op.
And they also have the soup containers now are compostable, or there's a note on them that says they're better than they were before.
Yep.
So I know I keep on more soup and not worry so much about it. But I want to ask you about Amazon,
Yep.
because of their transportation. Everybody loves them, I'll just get them from Amazon, but then they have to be trucked and delivered
Yep.
and all that. Do they focus on any of that?
I mean, all of them are to some degree.
Are they?
Absolutely. I mean, I know as much as people dislike Walmart, Walmart has done a lot from an environmental perspective. And it's in these strange places. One area that they've changed is they changed the shape of things like laundry detergent bottles, which actually has an impact on waste production. So moving from a round to a square container, you can fit more on a truck. So you're moving less trucks on the road, and so you just change the shape of the container. And so for them, they're so large, they're looking at ways to economize and reduce costs. So that's one way they've done it. They also move more towards concentrates and things of that nature. But so those are some of the things that are out there that are.
But there's a transportation part.
The transportation piece is huge, no matter where you look at it, and it can be frustrating. Buying online, just in general, can be frustrating. It looks like this, and then when I get it, it looks like that, and that's not what I saw. And now I got to ship it back. So, buying locals, supporting local economies, supporting local vendors is certainly, a better option. There's a lot of economic theorists who will support the notion of spending your money as close to home keeps your money close to home. Sending it to someplace else, that money doesn't come back into your community. So from a neighborly model, shopping locally and doing as much as you can locally is always the better way to go. So.
Can you tell us a little bit about the project to capture the methane that's coming from the landfill?
Sure.
I mean, that article in the Valley News was fascinating.
Yeah, it's an exciting project for sure. So she's asking about our gas to energy project in Lebanon. It's a project that I've been working on since 2009. It's taken a long time. The reason it's taken a long time is rules have changed, tax incentives has changed, just a lot of issues over the years have changed. Now so there are moments when things take a long time and you're like, oh, this is such a pain. Why? But every once in a while there's a situation that occurs in your life and you're just thankful that it took this long because you're in the right place now. If it had happened when you really were working hard at it, it wouldn't have been right. And so, yes, it's taken a long time. I've learned a lot in that time period. I think I'm a better person as a result. And the city's in a better position. So the project is very simple. I mean, we're extracting gas out of the landfill. So when you drive by a disposal site and there's an odd smell, that's your trash, okay? I'd just like to remind you that that is not something I did, okay? I contributed my own, but it's not all me. We've all, as a community, for the last 60 or 70 years, have contributed to that odor. And every time you throw something away in your garbage and it makes its way over there, you're participating in that. So it's collectively, we need to own that and recognize that. So the gas that's produced out of that decomposition of waste, a large portion of it, more than half, is methane. which has a pretty high BTU value and can produce electricity. So we're going to clean up the gas, remove all the unwanteds, and combust the methane in microturbines. We're not doing what's typical. Typically, these projects use reciprocating engines, or like a diesel engine that's converted to gas, with pistons and everything. This has one moving part, so the maintenance is low, but it also allows us to scale up or down depending on gas production. So we're able to generate more electricity as a result, consistently. So we will produce the equivalent of 900 homes of electricity coming out of the landfill. But what the city is planning on doing is actually offsetting our own load for the city of Lebanon. So this is where this is the right time to do this. Energy costs are going up on all fronts. The city is hedging this future cost increases by being its own energy producer and producing our own electricity. So the landfill will power the wastewater treatment plant, the water treatment plant, the school district, and a variety of other city functions will be produced locally from this waste product. So it's...
Will the stink go away?
Will the stink go away? Are you going to stop throwing things away? I'm just kidding. So methane doesn't actually have an odor. So when you're driving by and that methane has no odor. So you're not smelling methane. It's other things like something called hydrogen sulfide gas, which is generated when we throw away things like sheetrock. When sheetrock breaks down, the little bacteria passes gas, essentially, and that's what we have, is that stink. That's one of the contributing factors. So we continue to add more pipe into the landfill to pull more gas out, to manage those odors more regularly. There are things we can't help, and that's things like overcast days, where any sort of odor that might be coming from the site is literally trapped. And on a day like this, the same odor molecules exist, but they're blue skies or a good smelling day. But if you put a cloud cover over that, all of a sudden it's, what are you doing today? Nothing different. It's the weather.
That said, it doesn't smell as bad anywhere.
It shouldn't. No, and it does not. You're absolutely right. So
is that because it's better vetted?
So in 2013, as part of this progression, we installed a flare. So we're currently extracting the gas and burning it. So on a climate level, we're mitigating those damages. So in the past, it's referred to as fugitive emissions, it's just coming up all over the place and just emitting. Now we have collection pipes inside that we literally suck on the landfill and pull that gas to the flare where it's burned. And so that methane that was being emitted into the atmosphere is now being destroyed just by incineration, just burning it. So the plan is to just take that, put in a T-valve, send it this way instead of that way, and generate electricity. So, yeah. It's it sounds so simple, but it's just unbelievable. We have to negotiate with the utility company, and we've actually had some people in the city work with state legislation to make it more beneficial, because there were thresholds of the size of an offset project. So we had legislation passed to allow us to have a much larger project to offset more of our city load. So when the project comes online, the city of Lebanon will be 100% renewable. Right now it's 20%. We do a lot of solar in Lebanon, so 20% of the city government is run on solar. Landfill is essentially net zero with our own energy use, because we have solar panels on site that produce a copious amount of electricity. So it's pretty exciting. Yep.
Methane is compound, I'm not a chemist myself, but when you burn it, doesn't it break it down to its, what happens? Do you know?
I couldn't answer that because I'm not a chemist either. I mean, methane is CH4, I know that, so it's carbon and hydrogen, and yes, when it breaks down, there'll be some sort of,
The methane
there will be,
doesn't go with it,
right, and methane is a huge global warming potential, so destroying it reduces that global warming potential. But the other piece of this equation that we don't always talk about is that we're displacing a petroleum-based energy production. So instead of Lebanon receiving a megawatt of electricity that's coal-based, it's now waste-based that is just literally being wasted at this point, so it will displace. So not only are we, managing the methane in a particular fashion, but we're displacing a petroleum-based fuel product.
my question basically is, once it's broken down, it doesn't all go away, but more of it goes away, and it's also being reused.
Correct. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's going to be CO emitted, typically, it's like your vehicle, there's carbon dioxide and water is emitted. There was a plan years ago when we first started this where the emissions would run through a particular process to clean up to be a zero emission facility. So those are not out of the realm of possibility down the road, because I think what we need to do is kind of that, where just like we talked about these other cultures who look at things like a bicycle not as a waste or, well, I can recycle this, but looking at it as it is, and how do I use this as it is, to my benefit, to somebody else's benefit, whatever. But to do that on a lot of different levels, and even in things like emissions, where we're emitting something, there's elements, there's molecules, there's things that we're emitting, but in some cases, those can be products that could be used for something else. Like we had looked at using the emissions to run through an aquaculture facility, and actually algae would feed, we were going to get a certain type of algae that would feed on that emission. You produce algae, the algae becomes a biomass fuel or a food source. We had looked at farming tilapia. The algae would feed the tilapia, and it was just this very symbiotic process, and I think as a society, that's what we're going to be looking at more so. Instead of it just being, well, we produce this waste, down the river it goes, it's how can I use that? Because I just have this vision of, moving into an electric-based society requires batteries. So I think we're going to see a very different shift in the world. Right now, there's a lot of focus on petroleum. I think we're going to see this very unbelievable shift to rare earth metals. And that's a very different world. Rare earth metals are used, our lithium batteries, and we have a lot of electronic devices that we all use all the time now that require these rare earth metals. And I think we're going to see a different focus as we move down this road. And we're going to look at things differently because there's not a lot of rare earth metals. I mean, that's a very finite thing. Thank you. So we're going to have to look at our waste products as resources. So.
I'm going to ask one more recycling question. Plastic bags.
Okay.
I read somewhere that plastic bags that you take to Hannaford, for example, end up in building materials. Is that true?
So it's interesting because in the Upper Valley, I looked into this because I like to be able to answer the question. I want people to know the answer, even if it's not the answer you want. I want to give you the answer because I believe firmly in truth in recycling. So even if the answer's hard, but in this case, you're right. That the plastic bags that are collected at those locations make their way to a company called Trex Lumber, which is located here in the U.S., and they manufacture a composite decking material or park benches and things like that. But it's also important to note that every grocery store in the Upper Valley that recycles their plastic bags uses Trex lumber. So they all are using the exact same recycling avenue, but they advertise it very differently. Like Price Chopper will say, bring us all your plastic wrap. You know, Price Chopper says, we'll take your bread bags back, we'll take your dry cleaner bag back, we'll take whatever the plastic wrap is, they'll take it back. Whereas some of the others are like, we only want grocery bags. But it all goes to the same place. So it's just interesting how these different corporations promote this program, but they all go to the same place. So, you're welcome. Yes?
How do you recycle a battery?
What kind of battery?
Little one.
A little one.
Double A, triple A.
Not easily.
I'm
So when,
fire.
so the reality is there's not, like, I don't have a good recycling option for batteries. I try to encourage people to do rechargeable batteries, because rechargeable batteries, one, reduce waste, and two, are recyclable. So I have a recycling option for rechargeable batteries. So regular alkaline batteries are garbage, go in the trash. Yep.
So going forward, let's say this climate action group wants to put together some kind of a document. We kind of sit down with
Sure.
the brain
Yeah, happy to.
and get some of these things that you know about, that other people don't, maybe put it into a document that you share with other
Yeah,
such groups and those groups.
absolutely.
It's very helpful because, well, somebody was asking.
Thank you.
If they get a document that covers that, and there is, there's no place to help, but if we, of course, I'll have to get committee approval if we do. Sugar.
Well, look at me, I'm just one.
I know, but I think it would be, not to take much of your time, but he could probably supply us with.
Happily. Yep, happily. You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you.